So, who you texting? You're looking for another adventure?
No, I'm just messaging Mum about who we're visiting next, you know, getting prepared.
And what does she say? Where are we going now?
So his name is Jamie Gillum and he's got a great archive we can go look at.
Sounds good. And so it's like a private collection, is it? Yeah. I don't know about you, but it's the private collections, the private archives that have often got the best information. So yeah, let's go. Let's see what we can find out.
Sounds great.
Morning.
Hi, how are you, Jamie? You all right?
Hello, Ruby.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
I'm Stephen.
How are you?
Thank you. Good, thanks. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Do you want to come through?
Yeah.
Do you want tea or coffee or some water?
Maybe just pour me a glass of
Water.
that.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take a sip.
Oh, what a lovely home.
So I met Christina about 10 years ago, I think, when she was researching her book on your great-great-great-grandfather, right?
She's still at it, to be honest.
She never shuts up about him.
No, she doesn't.
It's a fascinating character.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
She's done so much work.
So, I see you've got a first edition of Lady Cobold's Pilgrimage to Mecca book. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, this is a really interesting book, and it's quite a rare book to find these days. But this is basically her account of her pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj. But it's effectively a diary of her pilgrimage, a very spiritual journey, as she describes it.
I know that Cobold and Bكتال knew each other.
Yeah, they were actually very good friends throughout the whole of Marmaduke Pictal's life. They were introduced by a mutual friend in London in 1914. So I think that's the year that Cobold had converted to Islam.
Right.
But Pictal was a great enabler of all his friends, particularly his Muslim friends in Britain. And so Pictal wrote a long 5-page review of Evelyn Cobold's pilgrimage to Mecca. It's a very warm review. I can quote from it. He says, "There are certain false ideas about Islam which still prevail in Europe. These misapprehensions, the delightful account which Lady Evelyn Cobold has given of her pilgrimage, ought to completely dispel." What's interesting is that the family have a letter that Pictal wrote to Lady Evelyn Cobold just a few months before the review was published, and actually is a little critical.
Right.
He specifically says that your adventures, as described in the book, are delightful, but the propaganda for Islam is rather an intrusion. So I think he was looking out for his friend Cobold to some extent. He was warning her what might happen, because this book is a defense of Islam. But I think by the 1930s, he was also a bit conscious of kind of rising sectarianism within Islam.
Right.
And he was kind of worried about if she was maybe being influenced by other external parties.
And it's Mohammed Sadu.
Pictal grew up in a middle-class religious family. In fact, his grandfather and his father were clergy of the Anglican Church. His stepsisters also, a couple of them were nuns, again, in the Anglican Church. So it was expected Pictal would follow his father and would join the clergy of the Church of England. And to some degree, that was his path. And his relations and connections in the Anglican Church were the catalysts that opened the door for him to be able to travel to the Middle East in the first instance. Pictal made his way to Palestine and traveled in Syria and parts of the Middle East. And it was that journey that Pictal began to see a kind of living Islam and was drawn to Arab civilization, Arab culture. When he returned to England, the images and the experiences that he had while traveling in the Middle East influenced him to start writing novels. So, for example, one of his famous works, Said the Fisherman, was actually born out of his watching Palestinian fishermen, you know, on the banks of the Mediterranean Sea and observing their simple but pious lifestyle.
He went to Egypt for a brief time in 1904, and then he returned in 1907 to 1908. This was an important period in Egyptian history because this was the time where Lord Cromer had really established firmly his rule. Now, Pickthall, this is one of the strange things about Pickthall. Something we have to think about, really, is that he became a Muslim, but he also remained, in certain key respects, a British imperialist. So when he went to Egypt, he had talks with Lord Cromer, and he thought that Lord Cromer was doing a marvellous job in Egypt. So he, in his fiction, in several of his writings, Children of the Nile, for example, which was published in 1908, he writes about the Arabi period, the revolution in Egypt of 1882 to 3, and he gives the impression that the revolutionaries were cynical, they were not genuine, and that the ordinary people didn't support them. So this was a view which he had adopted through his class background.
So I can show you some more documents and information related to Pickthall in my other room if you'd like to see them.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Pickthall's a really interesting character in the history of Islam in Britain and the West and beyond. He had a very wide reach and impact. He was very interested in languages as a schoolboy, and then he decided he wanted to become a diplomat. And he had a particular interest in the kind of Near East, what now we probably call the Middle East, and the Ottoman Empire. He really hesitated to convert to Islam. He was kind of on the verge of converting in the 1890s and then just before the First World War, but he didn't convert until 1917. And that's partly because he was such a committed Christian.
It must have been quite a big difficulty for him. If his family was such a, within the established Church of England.
Yes, absolutely. I think there was a real internal struggle, which obviously we don't know much about because it was purely personal. But I think it accounts for the kind of longevity of his transition towards Islam from the 1890s right through to 1917. And the actual crux, I think the crux of the matter, why he finally converted to Islam, it was during the First World War. And there was definitely a political kind of element to his conversion.
Interesting.
He was totally against British policy against the Ottoman Empire. He was very anti-Russian because he thought that Russia was a great threat to the British Empire in the East, and particularly India.
In 1917, you've got the famous Balfour Declaration in November of that year. Do we know, did he convert before that declaration, or was it a result after that declaration?
It's exactly at the same time, and there were lots of linkages, clearly. But he was very against the idea of the Balfour Declaration. He'd already gone on record as saying that while he respected the Jews in Palestine, he didn't particularly welcome what he called the more recent arrivals, and he was particularly adamant that Zionism was a threat and a danger to the region, a region that he loved and he'd first visited as a teenager in the 1890s. And he was very worried. He really foresaw lots of immense problems in the region, in Palestine and in the wider Middle East. So he was very heavily involved in a society called the Anglo-Ottoman Society, which was run by Muslims and their allies, non-Muslims. And he met some very politically active Muslims, particularly from India, during that time. And they certainly had a very important, profound influence on his thinking. As did Khwaja Kamaluddin, who'd come back to England in 1916 during the war and acted as something of a mentor. I don't want to overstate the idea that complete mentor, but he certainly helped guide Pickthall towards Islam in 1917. And in fact, Pickthall's formal conversion took place just prior to Kamaluddin giving a lecture in Old Bond Street about India in November 1917. And it's typical of Pictal, I think. It was a pretty low-key admission of his final conversion to Islam after all these years. He just, introducing the lecturer, who was Kamaluddin, he just said something like, "My fellow Muslim," and that kind of signified to the audience that this guy had finally converted to Islam. And a couple of days later, he went to the Woking Muslim Mission's London prayer hall and made a more formal announcement. So it's not a coincidence that Kamaluddin was literally by his side when he converted formally, or announced his conversion in that kind of autumn of 1917.
We know that he also spent a good amount of time in the subcontinent.
It's interesting that he went to India in 1920, and his reason that he gave, his kind of official reason, was that he was broke. And as someone who's read his correspondence and articles throughout his life, he was always arguing that he was broke. So he was offered the position of co-editor of the Bombay Chronicle in India at the end of 1919, 1920, which he accepted because he said that he basically needed the money. But it wasn't really quite true that he was going for the money. Some of those political figures that I'd mentioned earlier that he met in London included Muhammad Ali and his brother, who were the leaders of the Khilafat movement, which was an Indian movement founded in 1919 to support and defend the Ottoman Empire, and then slowly morphed into more of a cause for the self-government of India and independence. So he was very influenced by these people, and the Bombay Chronicle was a nationalist newspaper. So by Pictal accepting that editorship, he was signifying that his politics had shifted. He was actually starting to think that India should be self-governed.
For the British establishment, the problem of Pictal was that he was his own man. He couldn't be controlled by the British establishment. So if he can't be controlled, he can't be trusted. Pictal, with a man called Dusay Muhammad Ali, who was half Egyptian, half Sudanese, together with Pictal, they set up the so-called Anglo-Ottoman Society, which was to develop and encourage better relations between British Empire and the Ottoman Caliphate. But the materials that they produced to do this, again, caused a lot of concern for the British establishment, particularly his partner, Dusay Muhammad Ali, who it is said raised funds to buy arms for Muslims in Libya to raise up against the Italians.
Because he had argued so politically against the British government, he was kind of blacklisted. And then this continued into the World War I period, and they were actually under the surveillance of the British security forces. By the time the war ended, the question of the Turkish Empire was still not sorted out, because the British still went on encouraging Greece to fight against Turkey. Pictal really got very angry indeed. He said, as an Englishman, I am ashamed. As a Muslim, I am angry.
He was loyal, he was a patriot, although other people thought otherwise. But the fact that he was a convert to Islam and the fact that he was supporting the Ottoman Empire at a time of war made him something of an enemy. And he was unrelentless in his criticism of British government policy. It's quite staggering if you go back and look at his many hundreds of articles. He wrote so prolifically, arguing against British policy in the Middle East. And I do actually have a letter, which I could show you.
Yeah.
Pictal's letters are incredibly rare, but I found this really very recently tipped into a book by Pictal in America. And it's dated 31st of December 1914. So this is before his conversion to Islam. And it's written to an unknown correspondent. But that correspondent was clearly an ally of Pictal's who supported his defense of the Ottoman Empire, whereas most Britons did not support this. And Pictal writes, so on New Year's Eve 1914, I can assure you that your letter gives me great encouragement. A man is apt to feel a little lonely, likewise futile, when protesting vehemently against accepted things which he is powerless to change. It is horrible to see so great a lie triumphant, and here he's criticising the British press in particular, and the anti-Turkish rhetoric, claiming wholesale sacrifice of human lives. Thank you very much indeed for sympathising with my unfortunate friends.
That's great.
And Pictol himself writes in other letters, including to Aubrey Herbert, that he felt that he had become an enemy to the British state, including Sir Mark Sykes, who was the key advisor on Middle East to the British government and helped facilitate the Balfour Declaration. Sykes got very, very tired of Pictol in 1916-17 and actually wrote a memo asking whether Pictol could basically be conscripted and got out of the way so that he would stop writing anti-British rhetoric.
After the First World War, Pictol realised that trying to continue to support the existence of the Ottoman Empire was a lost cause. And the Treaty of Versailles, where Turkey was forced to withdraw from Eastern Europe and parts of the Middle East, really drew a line under the idea that the Ottomans were caliphs of large parts of the Muslim world. But he shifted his focus because to establish a caliphate within what was called India at the time, Pictol put his energies into that movement, and it could be said that that was actually one of the reasons that Pictol moved to India when he did. And he believed that the Muslims of India would be able to kind of create a kind of Muslim polity in the region. To some degree, he was right, because eventually we saw the creation of Pakistan.
Obviously, you said he was very interested in languages from an early age.
Yes.
And with his conversion to Islam, he was the first to translate a verified translation of the Quran into English.
He was the first British Muslim to translate the Quran into English. Although for Pictol, the Quran is the word of God and therefore is untranslatable. His book, I can show you the copy of the book if you like, as such. He called it the meaning of the glorious Quran.
Right.
Which sends a kind of a sharp signal, really, that this book is not actually translatable. Yeah. But he did his best to try and render this amazing text into English. And it was published in 1930.
The two early 20th century translators of the Quran into English, by Pictol, of course, himself, and by Leopold Weiss, Muhammad Asad, were very different approaches to the translation of the Quran. We can understand Pictol as a kind of romantic, a kind of poet, and his fictional works, if you like, they give us a glimpse into that poetical writing of Pictol, which of course lent itself to his translation of the Quran.
I know Tim's got a translation of his Quran that he speaks very highly of.
Yeah, this is my own working copy, rather the worse for wear. But it's kind of facsimile of the first edition, which I had bound in Egypt, actually, because I use it a lot and it was falling to pieces. So, meaning of the glorious Quran, explanatory translation by Mármádók Pictol. And you can see this is a facsimile of the first edition, so it's quite nicely typeset. That was actually done in Hyderabad in India in the 1930s. Wow. You can see here it's dedicated to the Nizam, traditional idea of aristocratic patronage. But he gave him the time and to do this translation, which to my mind is the best that one can do in terms of rendering the inimitable mu'jaz Quranic discourse into the very different semantic space of a Germanic language, with its resonances of the King James Bible, Shakespeare, with the freight that goes with particularly significant sacred vocabulary in the English language. It's a hugely complicated cultural task to translate between language groups, and particularly to translate scripture. Technically, it's not possible.
So hearing why this translation in particular you so favour it raises the question of why Al-Azhar University, the centre of Islamic learning at the time and still very much today, why did they reject it as a translation?
Well, that was a kind of crisis point in the acceptability of the translation into English. But perhaps if we go over to the library, you can relax a bit and I'll tell you the story.
Thank you so much. Yeah, let's do that.
Islam, of course, hasn't got a Vatican and certain established procedures for validating or granting an imprimatur to texts. But the next best thing is to go to some of the really ancient Islamic universities and Islamic institutions. And there is none more ancient and more reputable than Al-Azhar in Cairo. The issue was, of course, that if he was going to get their approval, he would have to persuade them that the translation was valuable, even though not a single one of the leading Azhari sheikhs at the time knew any English. And talking to a few people who, it seems, had only a passing knowledge of the language, they didn't accept it, and that this was the end of his cherished project. But of course, many in the Azhar, especially the wiser heads, the head of Al-Azhar at the time, somebody called Sheikh al-Maraghi, looked at Pictor and applied a kind of spiritual discernment and said, I think we can trust you, and it was authorized.
So how did Pictor pass away then? What happened after?
Well, Pictor retired from Indian government service in Hyderabad in 1935, the very end of the year, and he came straight back to England, partly because he was feeling his age. He wasn't that old, he's only in his early 60s.
Right.
But also his wife Muriel didn't particularly like living in India. She didn't like the climate. So they came back to England. Pictor was feeling quite ill. He'd suffered from typhoid from his very first trips to Palestine and Syria in the 1890s. He'd had a lot of bouts of malaria, especially when he was in India. And then he caught flu coming back to England. So they moved to Cornwall because they thought it would be a better place to live because it's slightly warmer on the southwest coast of England. And then he was working away in his study and he died suddenly of a heart attack in 1936. His wife Muriel arranged for his body to be brought up to London, and then it was transferred by train from Waterloo to Brookwood Cemetery. And the reason for that is that there is a Muslim burial ground at Brookwood. It's very close to Woking Mosque. There are lots of contradictions in Pictor's life, and he's a very complex man. I'm writing a biography about him now, and I'm really struggling to get to grips with his changing views and opinions. From a practical point of view, Marmádók Pictor wrote a lot. I mean, for a biographer, he almost wrote too much, because it's taken many years to read as much as I can of his writings. Pictor was only 61 years old, which was a real tragedy. I think he had an awful lot more to give. He was working further on his edition of the Quran. He was rewriting some of the lectures that he gave in India about Islam and modernism, which I think are really quite interesting articles. He was rewriting those for publication. He had lots of other writing projects on the go, and so all of these came to nothing. He died suddenly. So I'm really interested in the combination of his religious and theological views and his politics. And I believe he was a great writer. He could really write well in a kind of very accessible way. There's a lot of repetition if you, like me, you read all of his material. But he really got to the point, and he didn't hold back. He was very courageous at a time when it was difficult to put your head above the parapet.
I noticed when we were in the house earlier that you had some letters that are clearly written from the, I don't know, late 19th, early 20th century. I was wondering, are those Marmaduke Pickett-Hall's letters at all?
No, actually, they're written by Lord Headley just before he became Lord Headley, when he was Roland Allenson Wynne. I can show you the letters.
Yeah, please. Oh, wow.